All right, join me on page 134 in your social studies textbook. We are now on chapter 4, lesson 1, the Nile River, the Nile Valley. Follow along. You are there. It's late October in Egypt in 3500 BC. For months, the Nile River has been flowing over its banks, as it does every year. Now the water level is falling, and the land can be seen again. After such good flooding, there will be a plentiful harvest, your mother says. Your father says that it's time to start planting and asks you to get the plow and seeds. You attach the plow to the animals and fill your sack with seeds. Your father guides the cows so that the plow digs long, straight furrows in the soft, rich soil. You drop the seeds into the furrows. Another year of farming has begun. And this image, just so you know, if you're looking at the video, this is a satellite image of the Nile River and the Nile Delta. So you can see how green and lush it is along the Nile River and particularly down along the Nile Delta. And then you can see how arid and dry it is on the regions outside of the Nile River and the Nile Delta. So you can see how much farming and stuff like that can go on along the Nile, but out here it's going to be much more difficult, obviously, because there's not a lot of water. Okay, continuing on page 135, the land of the Nile. The Nile River is the world's largest river. From East Central Africa, the Nile flows north for 4,160 miles until it empties into the Mediterranean Sea. So again, looking up, taking a break real quick, and look at the screen. This is the Mediterranean Sea right here. So the Nile River flows out, and then this is the delta where it kind of breaks off into a bunch of smaller little rivers and feeds off into the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, continuing in your text. The ancient land, once called Lower Egypt, lies at the Nile's mouth at the Mediterranean Sea and is made up mainly of the Nile Delta. A delta is a triangular piece of rich land formed from soil deposits at the mouth of some rivers. So this would be Lower Egypt. If you're looking at the screen, the Nile Delta region, this is Lower Egypt. Okay, continuing in your text, follow along. The higher land to the south was known as Upper Egypt. There, the narrow and fertile Nile Valley follows the Nile River for more than 600 miles. Even further south, the Nile runs between desert cliffs in a series of 6 cataracts, or waterfalls. So they're talking about this being Upper Egypt. Where the Nile is still flowing, you can still get some farming along the Nile River, but as you go further south, there's going to be less of that. You're gonna run into cataracts or waterfalls. Okay, continuing now in your text. The Nile River cuts across the arid or dry desert known as the Sahara. Only on the fertile lands by the Nile could early Egyptians grow crops of wheat and barley. So again, looking at the video, this is the Sahara Desert. But notice the green cutting through. That's all along the Nile River. Okay, continuing in your text. Heavy rains fall in the mountains at the Nile's source far to the south. This rainfall caused the river to overflow its banks. The yearly flooding deposited silt along each bank, making the soil fertile. The physical setting supported permanent settlement. By 4000 BC, farming villages lined the Nile River from the delta to the first cataract. To the ancient Egyptians, the Nile was the giver of life. So you can see this, people weren't setting up, villages and cities and things like that in this area. If you're looking at the map now on the screen, they're not setting up places to live here because they couldn't farm here. But all along the Nile River and into the Nile Delta, people were setting up cities, towns, farming villages because this was nice, fertile land. So it's the giver of life because fresh water is what you need to grow plants, and plants are what we eat. And so it gives us sustenance, life. Okay, turning the page, following along on page 136, controlling the river. To the ancient Egyptians, the Nile was the giver of life, but it also took life away. In some years, the rains were not heavy enough to make the Nile overflow its banks. The land baked in the sun, and the crops dried up. Without a harvest, many Egyptians starved. In other years, too much rain fell at the Nile's source, and the river flooded wildly, drowning people and destroying crops. Over time, the Egyptians developed agricultural techniques that gave them some control of the Nile. At first, they built simple irrigation ditches to bring water to their fields. Later, they built dams and dikes to control the yearly flooding. They also learned to store water in ponds or pools for use during times when the river was low. So these are some of the innovations that they came up with to help solve the problem of the flooding, and also to help solve the problem of some years when they would experience drought and not enough water from the Nile River. Okay, continuing in your text. As the Egyptians learned to benefit more and more from the Nile, the populations of settlements along its shores increased. Irrigation became so important to the food supply in these growing communities that it was supervised by government officials. Eventually, the government began to have complete control over all farming and irrigation. The authority of the early Egyptian leaders was based on their ability to provide water for crops. Over time, they built more complex irrigation systems. In good years, large harvests produced surplus food, so the rulers stored it to feed people in times of drought. They also used surplus food to feed the laborers on public works projects. Okay, I'm going to read the geography box now. It's got a number 3 next to it. Aswan High Dam. In 1970, Egypt completed the Aswan High Dam, one of the world's largest embankment dams. Embankment dams are constructed of earth and rock. The Aswan High Dam holds back floodwater during rainy seasons and releases water during the times of drought. It also generates huge amounts of electricity. Because of the dam, the Nile no longer overflows its banks to deposit rich soil. Farmers now depend on fertilizers to enrich their land. Also, the lack of new deposits of silt has caused land along the Nile to erode. The lake formed by the dam would have covered ancient temples and settlements. So in the 1960s, an international team of workers cut apart the temples and moved them to higher ground, where they were reassembled. Interesting. Okay, turning the page to page 137, a source of religion. Follow along. Even though the Egyptians learned to control the Nile with irrigation systems, they could not always predict or tell in advance what each year's flooding would be like. They nervously wondered if the Nile's water would be too low or too high. The Egyptians also could not predict exactly when the floods would come. In some years, the floods arrived early, but in others, the floods arrived late. The flooding of the Nile influenced the early Egyptians' religious beliefs. To find order in the world around them, the Egyptians created stories to explain events in nature. In these stories, gods or goddesses controlled a specific part of nature. From these stories, the Egyptians developed beliefs in many gods and goddesses. In this way, like the Sumerians, the early Egyptians formed a polytheistic religion. And remember, polytheistic or polytheism means a belief in many gods. Okay, continuing in the text. One of the Egyptians' most important gods was the sun god Ra, also pronounced Re. Early Egyptians noticed that the sun's position is predictable. Every day the Egyptians saw the sun rise, move across the sky, and set. They believed that the sun was a god who was born each day and died each night. This cycle led the Egyptians to believe that their own lives would continue in an afterlife, or a life after death. Belief in the afterlife became an important part of early Egyptian culture. Another important god was Hapi. Happy, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, god of the flood. The Egyptians held many festivals to honor Happy, hoping he would reward them with good harvests. Other important gods included Horus, the sky god, and Osiris, the god of the next world. Each Egyptian city had one or more special gods or goddesses. As a city gained strength, its god became more important. For example, when the city of Thebes grew powerful, belief in the city's god, Ammon, spread. The Egyptians combined Ammon and Ra, considering Ammon-Ra their most powerful god. All right, thanks for following along. You can continue now on your social studies assignment for today.